Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar, Committing Delivery Times Based on Material and Capacity Constraints. My name is Martin Karlovic and I'm CEO and co-owner of Netronic Software from Germany, and I'm your host for today's webinar. As always, when we run webinars, you're on mute, and this is for sake of organizational reasons and not because I don't want to communicate with you. So if you have any question, then feel free to use the GoToWebinar chat pane. When I'm on PowerPoints, I will most likely answer the question straight away. When I'm doing demos, I might not see it, and then I will answer the question either at the end of the demo or at the end of the webinar. So if you have a question, hang in here and you definitely get an answer. If I'm unable to answer, or if it's getting too complicated, too specific, or too, let's say, individual, then I will revert back to either emails or setting up a meeting with you directly. Also, I will share my contact details at the end of this webinar so that you can reach out to me via email and or connect on LinkedIn if we are not connected, and then you also can ping me there, and you definitively will get a response. With this, let's jump into the topic for today, which is actually the first webinar of this year. Looking forward to much more to come. But this is a webinar actually we had to cancel on short notice at the end of last year because I had some issues at that point of time with my voice. The voice is back, the year is new. And so now let's start with talking about how to commit delivery times when you work with Microsoft Dynamics 365 Business Central, and make these commitments based on understanding your material constraints and your capacity constraints. And end of last year, I started to kind of categorize these the webinars that we run, so that you in the very beginning of the webinar also can get an understanding of this is the right webinar for you or not, because some of the webinars that we do, they focus on certain feature and function. They provide a drill down or a deep dive into certain functions, whereas other webinars are more on business processes and best practices. And then we have webinars who are really meant for beginners, and we have webinars that are like kind of more for people who know us and know our products, who are using them or who have been using them, who are selling them, who have been selling them. And so then, like, today's webinar is definitely not a feature and function webinar, and it's also not a beginner webinar. Today's webinar is a how-to webinar, how to commit delivery times, taking into account material constraints and capacity constraints. And this is definitely a bit of an advanced topic. It is a bit of an advanced topic when it comes to Business Central, but it is also a more advanced topic when it comes to our product. So if you are here, like if this is your first contact with us, if this is your first Netronic webinar that you attend, if this is the first presentation you see me give, then feel free to stay here. But also please notice that I will not explain every single aspect of the VAPS, of the Visual Advanced Production Scheduler for Business Central right now. I even will not explain in all details what the product is, but I assume that you who are on this webinar have a certain level of understanding of our product, and I want to really focus on this one aspect, and this is committing delivery time. So then we have a lot of content on our website. We have introductory webinars. So if you're more on the beginner side of things, then and you don't know where to start, then send me an email and I guide you some places where to start. And or we set up a meeting, either you and I directly, or you and one of my colleagues, where we give you an introduction to our products. But today I will try to focus more on the heavier lifting side of things when it comes to Business Central and the VAPS. There is some content that I really recommend to watch again, or to watch for the first time in case you missed. So I ran like 3 webinars starting from May last year, so in May, October, and November. And all of these webinars, they, to some degree, well, they set the scene for today's webinar, or they provide some ground level information on which I build now in this webinar. So I definitely recommend. So if you find the content of today's webinar, if you find this interesting, then also look into those 3 webinars. I spoke in May, and we all have them on that page here. So it's if you go to our Business Central area, then go to, I think it's called event or webinars, and then there's a recording page where we list them all on the VAPS, and then you can look, and then they are sorted top down from the most recent to the later, to the ones that are ran earlier last year. I started with talking about capable to promise and production scheduling. So there is a function in Business Central called capable to promise, which many partners recommend their customers not to use. And I provided a provocative view that for some scenarios, how it could make sense to use this function. And I will talk about capable to promise again today, but much shorter than I did here. So if you feel later on in the second half of this webinar that what I show you there is interesting to you or might be relevant for you guys, then definitely watch this webinar, because this webinar provides a lot of like theory and a lot of explanation on how this function in Business Central actually works, what the strengths are and what the weaknesses are. Then I talked about making realistic delivery time commitment with Business Central, but I looked at it only from a capacity perspective. So I talked about various options that you have, and I used both our products, VPS and VAPS, to give you some ideas how you could make realistic delivery time commitment. But when I spoke about realistic in October last year, I actually meant realistic in terms of capacity. Then in November, I really gave a deep dive into our material availability functionality that comes with the VAPS. So if you, and I will talk about this in a minute. So if you install the VAPS, you actually get a feature that is called EMAT, earliest material availability date. And in November, I kind of explained this function. It explained how it works. I shared why I feel that this is a really useful function, but I also shared what are the weaknesses of this function, because if you build a product, if you build a function, like every coin has 2 sides, and the EMAT functionality brings a lot of additional value if you're a manufacturing customer working with Business Central, but it also has some weaknesses that you should be aware of. And I really revealed both. And now what actually with this webinar I want to do is like I want to mix some of the content that I shared here and here and here, and like put this all into one scenario where we now know how we get material availability information. We know how to make a realistic schedule in terms of capacity. We also know that there is a capable to promise function in Business Central, and I want to mix them all and talk about like scheduling based or with material constraints and capacity constraints. And before I drill into this, just for those of you who do not know the VAPS that well, in essence, we can like state that the VAPS is built on 3 main pillars, and these 3 main pillars are also the first 3 topics that I dig into when we have a new customer whom we are training and whom we are onboarding with the VAPS. Then the first thing that we will train and teach and educate our customers on are these 3 pillars. And these 3 pillars, or the fundament that the VAPS is built upon, is that it schedules with finite capacity. So it's a finite forward capacity scheduling. So not a backward scheduling, but it is always forward scheduling. So it is as soon as possible and not just in time. But it makes sure that it never overutilizes machine centers and work centers as Business Central does. And hence the idea is to give you a realistic schedule, an actionable schedule, taking into account your capacity constraint that you have. The second pillar that the VAPS is built on is a function that we call EMAT, and this stands for earliest material availability date. So And there are a lot of material availability information in Business Central, but they are all related to the item. So on the item, you can see the material availability by period, by event, by whatever. So you have a lot of functions actually drill into the availability of that item. But Business Central lacks the capability to give you material availability information on the production order, or if you have a production order with multiple production order lines, on the production order lines. So then you would need to go into the component lines, and then from every component go back to the item and check the availability there, which can become, if you have like a deep BOM, as some of our customers have, with tens or dozens or even hundreds of items in the BOM, then this can become very, very cumbersome and time consuming. And so with the VAPS, we give you actually a function to determine the earliest material availability date on production order level, on production order line level, on production order routing line level, and on production order component line level. And then the third pillar is that with the VAPS, we allow you actually to make production simulations. So you can build various versions of your schedule, compare them, and publish them. And today, with this webinar, I will like look and show you how those two pillars that I have here in green, how they kind of play with each other, and how they can help you to get, I would say, more realistic delivery time commitments, taking into account both your capacity constraints and your material constraints. And also I laid out this graph in the way I laid it out. So I would say if we would have built the VAPS without the production simulations, but with the finite capacity scheduling functionality and the EMAT functionality, the VAPS would still work very well. It would provide a significant value. Having the production simulations makes the fundament just more robust and makes the product even more useful. But if we would have taken away either the EMAT pillar or the finite capacity scheduling pillar, then we would have an imbalance here, and the product would not stand on solid ground. So these two pillars, the finite capacity scheduling and the EMAT functionality that work hand in hand, I think they make the VAPS a very, very solid product. And then there are like the production simulation just make the fundament even more robust. But now let's not talk about the VAPS in the first instance, but let's take about the process of making delivery time commitment. And here the question is, and if I ask a customer a question, I always get different answers. Like I ask, and I see there is actually a typo. Sorry for that. Let me quickly correct this. This is sometimes the German spell checking makes like rubbish words out of good English words. So who is or who should be responsible for making delivery time commitments? So who in your company is responsible for telling the customer when they will get their delivery? And if we simplify this, then there can be two types of people who are responsible for this, or who should be responsible for this, right? And you can argue, is this sales? Because sales or customer service, they are the people who have the direct communication with the customer. They have to stand in for the customer. They take the order and they are in charge for managing customer relations. Or should production be in charge for making delivery time commitments? So should they always be on the safe side and say, okay, this is realistic and we add some buffer, and yeah, you can tell the customer you will get this thing that is so urgent for them in 4 months from now, but then we are on the safe side of things. So it is really hard. It is really hard. There is no absolute right answer. And I have seen customer cases where I was with a room of people and asked, like, who's responsible? Is it sales? And then the people started laughing, and these were all production people. And they said, hey, we will never make sales make our schedule, because then we would end up in chaos. But I had the same case where I said, hey, who is is in charge for making the delivery commitments for you? Is it production? And then the people were laughing, saying, hey, if we wait for the production guys, we would lose all the customers. So it is really hard There is no right and wrong. I think there is just adequate based on what type of company you is, how your processes are, and also how good your systems are, and like where you draw the line. But I still recommend that you draw a line, that you give the responsibility either to the one group or to the other group. If you don't do, you will just end up in chaos and in everlasting conflicts between at least those two groups of people. And the interesting thing is, and we will look into this, if there is the possibility that you have different responsibilities. So in one company it is sales who is responsible, in another company it is production, then we also should think of different workflows. So then we, as a scheduling vendor, I should not come and say, here's how it works. We don't care how you do it, and we don't care who is responsible. Here's how it works. But we thought about like what are the workflows if the one type of person is responsible for making the delivery time commitments, and what should be the processes if the other type of person are responsible for making this commitment. And I will look into both workflows. I will start with this one where production is in charge for making delivery time commitments, because this is what I see that resonates more with the majority of our customers, although I also work with customers who do it differently. But when production is in charge for making delivery time commitments and communicating these dates then to the salespeople, who then should get it confirmed by the customers, then a very valid workflow is that you create a production order and create a planned one, because this is the most vague production order in Business Central. Then you run the EMAT function, the earliest material availability date function, to check if you have material issues with the newly created production order or not. And then you can add the production order to the schedule via the VAPS, and then this takes into account the earliest material availability date information that you just calculated and the capacity constraints. Most likely, you have the need to create purchase orders. So most likely you won't have all material in stock, or you won't have yet all material on purchase orders. But then you put it to the schedule, take into account capacity constraints, and from there on, like, get an earliest demand date based on capacity, and then you can check against the lead time and create the purchase orders. Then you communicate the date to the sales and get it confirmed. If it's confirmed, change the production order status to firm planned, and then you can reserve it against the sales order. And now you can create purchase orders. So you will have cases here where material is missing, but you put the production order already on the schedule, and we will look into this example quite extensively in a very few minutes. The other process is, if sales is responsible for making the delivery time commitment, then you can create a sales order. And then the salespeople actually have the option to run the capable to promise function. And I recommend this only, and I should make this bracket, like I should make this red, bold, italic, underlined, and whatever. So there is a function capable to promise, which is very, very dangerous if your system is not set up that, in quotes, correctly. But if you have set up your system in a certain way, then this capable to promise function can actually be very useful. And at the end of the webinar, I will run also a scenario where I will do this, and where I will give you a very quick look at what I mean with if the system is set up correctly to support that scenario. And then Business Central tells you when you're capable to deliver. And then you can communicate that to the customer and get the date confirmed. You can accept the suggestion. And then on the planning worksheet, if you accept the suggestion on the planning worksheet, you already have the suggestion to create a new production order and the required purchase order. It's as easy as this. And then you create the purchase order, the production orders, and then the production scheduler just have to add the production order to the schedule and do the fine tuning, maybe assign it from one machine to the other or move it a little bit around in time. But everything more or less is done, and the production order just makes the production planner just makes sure that it gets to the right machine and right point of time, so that people, and then releases it so that people also can work on it. And we will look at both scenarios in this webinar. I will have a couple of examples here so that you get familiar with the VAPS and how this works in terms of delivery time commitments, and then looking at material constraints, and then we look at the second process as well. And with this, let's actually look what it means with taking into account material and capacity constraints, as was the title of the webinar. So this means actually when you create a new production, or when you have a demand for an item that you produce, you can have material constraints or you can have capacity constraints. And I looked at this in a kind of matrix way and said, okay, there is a case where I have no material constraint and where I have no capacity constraint. So I get a production order for a due date that the customer is requesting. All material is on stock, for example, and I have the capacity to get it done in time. And this is, of course, the most easy case. And in my demo system, just to familiarize, to warm up a little bit in terms of scheduling, I created an example for this, and we can look at this. So I have a sample item to run through this case where everything is easy peasy, right? Let's warm up. We have no constraint. You have no material constraint, no capacity constraint. Very easy. And the case is, the sample is like the product 00024. And with this, let's look the first time for this webinar and the first time for this year into my Business Central. And of course, let me log in here again. Very easy. So what I will do now is, wonderful Business Central, I'm creating production order. I do it like it was planned, production order to be as vague as possible. I do it like in the process we discussed, like a customer, we have a request for this item. This was 0024, if I remember right. Yeah. And the customer is requesting 40, and the date that they are requesting is for the 17th of March 24. Just by the way, my work date is the 31st of January. So they are requesting it to get in whatever, in 6 weeks from now, right? 7 weeks from now. And I have a pretty solidly full schedule. So then I create the production order so that the routing is applied. You see now I have, and you know this, I have now the routing line. So now Business Central did some planning against infinite capacity. I'm not sure if this would work, if the CTX 400 machine is free, if my assembly team has something to do on the 15th of March. I still all don't know this, because infinite capacity Business Central, right? And also Business Central kind of populated the BOM into the component line. So I see I need a couple of items here that I need most likely to purchase, right? So then now the production order is created, and now I need to schedule it. So I said this is the case where I have no material constraint, no capacity constraint, so easy peasy. We go to the VAPS, into the simulations area, and as said before, let me delete the simulation. We can create multiple simulations, but before we create a simulation, because now I have a new demand in the system, new demand for components, I run what we call the EMAT allocation. So I calculate the material availability per production order. And just once jumping back, what we did now is, let me go back to the planned production I just created. It's just this one. If you look now very carefully, it gives me an earliest material availability date, and it tells me, hey, the material that I need to produce this item, and I need to produce this item by the 17th of March, this material is already available today, because today is the 31st of January. Right? So with starting this function, we actually looked at the demand, at the component demand from this production order and the others, and we looked at component supply. And in this case, all the items that I need here are items that I do have on stock. So we could allocate those items to the production order. So the component to the production order, all on that date. And because everything is on stock, we could actually say, okay, the material is already available today. So if this is today and the material is fully on stock, I definitively have no material issue. So let's look at the capacity side of things, and this is where the VAPS comes into play, because now that I have this material availability information on the production order line, on the production order component line, even on the production order routing lines, if I would work with routing link codes, then I can create a simulation. So I can look what production orders I have in a time frame from 1 week ago until 12 weeks in the future. I want to check first availability information. So I do the availability color scheme that tells me if I have somewhere a material issue. So it will be green or red. Green, no material issue, and red if there is a material issue. And then I view the simulation. So I access my production schedule graphically. And now what I see, and this is what the VAPS gives me, is I see my production schedule. So all these boxes here are my operations, my production order routing lines that I already scheduled on those machines. You see everything is in green, very well tuned demo data, no material shortages. And then I have one production order on standby. This is everything that you see on standby is what was added to Business Central or what changed in Business Central. So this shows me actually currently the dates on the standby resource as Business Central calculated them. And we know the material is available from here, from the 31st of January. So the red line is today. And we see Business Central wants to have this finished by here. And we see we have a lot of capacity available. So there are no capacity constraints, and hence if I schedule this, if I add this to the schedule, it will end up somewhere way earlier than week 11, and adding it to the schedule works either on right mouse click by apply routing or apply alternative routing, or if I have multiple production orders, I also can schedule them and adding them all, which I do. And if I add them, you see we moved it to here. We could squeeze it in already also here on that machine, then it could go to the assembly team quite early, and we made, and then we could squeeze it also into quality control. So we made use of some free capacity here. And as we have no material constraint and no capacity constraint, we could use, if we like, the available capacity as early as possible. And we actually tell the customer, okay, we will deliver it by week 9, by the end of week 9, whatever, or mid of week 9. In the beginning of week 9, we will be finished, right? So this was like very easy scheduling. And then once I'm done, once I'm happy with the schedule, I leave the simulation. We write everything into what we call the simulation table. And if we want to update the production orders, then we can publish the simulation, and then we write the data back into the production order. So now this firm planned production order that I scheduled, this planned production order that I scheduled, this got updated. So now it's starting on the 19th, finishing on the 27th, and needs to be finished on the 17th of March. So we updated all the routing lines. We also changed, because I changed the routing. Now it went to the beta and to the Phoenix, because we had some free capacity there earlier than on the typically on the machines that we needed. So we made good use of an as soon as possible finite capacity scheduling, and we kind of didn't need to take into account material constraints because there were none, right? The material was available. So that was the one case that was a little bit the warm-up case. So now let's look at the next case. The next case that can happen is I still can have everything on stock, but I can somehow be capacity constrained, right? There can be the case that I still have all components that I need, either on stock or getting from a purchase order or from a transfer order from another location, but I have a capacity constraint. So actually, the customer is requesting an earlier delivery than I can facilitate. And let's look, and I have another item created that we can look at. This is the item 25. And again, let's look and see what we can doing here, how we can schedule this. So I'm going to create another planned production order, this time for the item 25. And this time the customer wants 60 unit and they want them by the 6th of March. And you saw the 6th of March actually, like this was when my schedule still looked tight. So I refreshed the production order, and again, we don't have any material availability information, because if you go to the component line, we see this is still pending because we never calculated this. So then the next step is, when we work with the VAPS, before we build a new simulation, we run the EMAT allocation again. And the EMAT allocation, by the way, is something that you can also put into the job queue, so that this is done. This, what I do manually here now, is done automatically, for example, during the night. Now again, we have earliest material availability information also for the production order we just added. We create a new simulation, look at the schedule, and see what we can doing when we are not material constrained but capacity constrained. So I look at this again. Now we have the production order that we scheduled before. This is now part of the schedule. Right, so the firm plan that we scheduled before is now part of the schedule. It utilizes machine centers and work centers. And now we see actually we have this production order sitting here, and it is shown in red because now Business Central positioned as to I would need to start in the past, which is somehow rubbish. Business Central sometimes does this, that it tells me you have to start in the past. You would have need to start in the past to get the date done. And if we look at the earliest material availability date, so this is the 31st of January, so it's today, so that if I add this to the schedule, for example, apply alternative routing, it starts from today, and then we see, okay, we are capacity constrained. So the earliest spots to add to the schedule on that machine is here, and then here on the saw, and then it goes to milling, and then it goes to quality control, and we will be not able to meet the customer delivery date. So what I could do now is I could manually interfere into the schedule and say, okay, actually, I want this to run on that machine. So I change the milling machine. I reassigned it to another machine, and then I can say, okay, from here, I want to schedule the successors and see if I utilize capacity earlier. And then you see now it is feasible. So initially, based on the routing that we had on Business Central, let me go back these one step or these two steps. Based on the routing we had on Business Central, I had a capacity issue. I'm not able to finish this in time, although I have a lot of flexibility on the material because the material is all on stock, right? If we look at this, go here, earliest material availability today, all components as we calculated it, all available today. However, the machines that I need, the CTX 400 in turning, the saw, and the milling, the Wagner, they are quite busy and we have to wait quite a long time. So initially it tells me, hey, I cannot meet the date that the customer is requesting. And then if I accept that I have a really great, a huge backlog in turning and have a huge backlog in sawing, but I see that once it is done in sawing, I have some free capacity on another mill. And if the TC229 brother is capable of doing the same, then I can reschedule it from here. And then I can say, okay, now from here on, make this, finish this as fast as possible, given the final capacity that we have, and then I'm finishing on time. So then I kind of, with the help of the VAPS, with some visual tools that guided me, plus some scheduling instruments that facilitate final capacity scheduling, I actually could solve the case. So I'm not material constrained, but I was capacity constrained. But although being capacity constrained, I can meet the due date. So then actually the case is solved. That looks good. I publish it and like build my production schedule. I'm fine. I could communicate to my salesperson, hey, look, you can confirm then the date they were requesting. I could squeeze this in. Now let's get the order from them so that we can like change the status and firm plan the production order. Then the next case, and now it's getting interesting, more interesting. Like the next case is I have a material constraint, but I have free capacity, right? So let's look actually how we would identify a material constraint with the VAPS, and then what we can do there. And again, I have an item for this. This is item 26, and the workflow is again the same as before. Again, in my company, the production planner is responsible for committing delivery dates. So I create another planned production order now for the item 26. And I want 50 to be ready on the, there was a too much on the 20th of March. I let Business Central plan this, and looks solid, starting on the 14th, finishing on the 19th. No material information here. So Business Central planned this, right? Business Central didn't give me any warning, like, hey, you have some material issues to meet this date. So now I have created the production order. I go to the simulations. I calculate my earliest material availability date again for all production orders, so including the one that I added. This is complete. So then I can create a new simulation. I can view it again. And I will see a new production order on the standby resource that I have to add to the schedule to confirm a delivery date based on material constraints and based on capacity constraints. And now let's look how it looks like. Like, it looks like this. It is a production order on standby. And now for the first time, we see actually red appearing. And the first two operations are in red, and the last ones, they are already in green. And this color red tells me now that the date where they are positioned right now, so the date where Business Central put them, is earlier than the earliest material availability date for that production order. So how is that? So again, let's open, I double click, I open this planned production order, item 26, 50 units, due on the 20th of March. And because we ran the EMAT calculation, we now have an earliest material availability date set on the 18th of March. Business Central, not knowing this date, scheduled the production to start on the 14th. But the material, the earliest date that the material is available is on the 18th of March. So where does this date come from? So let's drill down into the component lines. And on the component lines, we see actually we have a couple of items that are available on the 31st of January. So they are available today. These are the items I have on stock. But this last item here, this last item is available at earliest on the 18th of March. So where does the 18th of March come from? Well, let's look at this item and let's explore this item a little bit more. So we see here, we have a demand for that item as to Business Central on the 14th of March for 250 pieces. Now let's look how this item looks like, and let's go to the item card. And there we see we have a demand from components lines of 250. These are the ones that we just had on the component line we looked at on our planned production order. We don't have a production order that produces this item. We also don't have a job that produces it. We don't assemble them. There's also no transfer order delivering it. But we have a purchase order actually for 300 units in the system, or purchase orders. So let's see which purchase orders we have in the system. And I actually only have one purchase order in the system. So we are purchasing that item that we would need here, 300 units, and the expected receipt date right now is the 18th of March. So we don't produce that item. We do not have it on stock. So the only supply source is this purchase order, and the purchase order tells me right now, and we can look into this document as well. So let me look into this document. Let me look into the purchase order. Very important, I have not a promised receipt date, so my vendor didn't tell me anything, but I have an expected receipt date. So this is based on the lead time from this item. So the expected receipt date is the 18th of March. So the 18th of March, if I have no stock, and if I do not build this, and if I no transfer it, this is the earliest date that I get this component, that I get that item. And this is what you see here on the earliest material availability date component line. And as the 18th of March is the date when all of the required components are available, we put this as the earliest material availability date against this production order line. And Business Central scheduled it before because it wasn't aware of this. We calculated it afterwards, and this is information that comes from the VAPS that Business Central standard doesn't know. But the VAPS knows, and it shows us. And so now look at this. And I said this is the example where we have a material constraint but no capacity constraint, right? You see, I have a lot of free capacity here. I actually could get this done. I mean, I could add this to the schedule here. It would go here somewhere. It would go here. So most likely, if I would ignore my material shortages, I would tell the customer I would be ready week 10. But I can't because the material arrives here. So if I add this to the schedule, it moves to the right. It moves to the right because it takes the material availability as a hard constraint. Although I have free capacity, we don't utilize the capacity to get this done because we don't have the material. And now I actually I cannot solve this, right? The only thing I can do, I can call my vendor and say, hey, can you deliver faster? Can you promise me a date that is earlier than the 18th because I have a production that we urgently require? But if the vendor tells us, well, sorry, we suffer from the same supply chain issues than all the other suppliers as well, then we have to accept this. Although we have free capacity, we have a material constraint, so we need to tell our customers, okay, look, we can't deliver on the 20, so we can't deliver mid of week 12, but we will deliver at the end of week 12 or beginning of week 13, depending on how we communicate with the customers. So now we are material constraint, not capacity constraint. And that was the example I want to show. I published the simulation because I can't do anything with this. We will communicate this to the customer, and well, somehow, most likely they have to accept if we don't manage to accelerate our vendor or if we don't manage to kind of source the item elsewhere. So now let's look at the next case. The next case is we have material constraint and we have capacity constraint. Now it's getting fun, right? So now we are getting there what you face every day, right? You have material issues, you have your vendors not reliable, and you have you're running full capacity, hopefully. So let's look at this case. And again, I have an example for this, and this is like the item 27. And you know, now the flow of this webinar, we again create a planned production order. And the one that I'm going to create is for that item 028, 27, sorry for that. It's case 4 that we're doing, and I want 80 pieces, and I want them on the 8th of March. Let Business Central plan this as we did before. So it's planned. I go to my simulations. I create my earliest material availability information. And I highly recommend that you put this into your nightly job queue so that you always have this current. We view, there is no simulation to view. I need to create it first. Meaningful error message, by the way. And now we can view this. And this is the case that I would bet many of you have. And if we look at this in the VAPS, this is where Business Central put it, given the demand, and it shows red. So it shows red after we calculate the earliest material availability date information because of the following reasons. So if we look at this, Business Central, based on the demand date we put here, said we need to start this on the 21st of February, backward scheduling. The earliest material availability date, although I calculated it, is empty, and this is for reasons. So if we drill down why this is red and why this is empty, we figure out the following. So we need those 5 items. And if we look at the very last column here, this is also information that comes with the VAPS functionality. We see there's an earliest material availability allocation type, and in the first 4 lines, let me make this smaller so that we can see it actually. Hopefully this making it smaller works without crashing the system. It takes long. Okay. It says here allocation removed, and here it says allocation failed. So when we make the earliest material availability date calculation, we would never calculate, we would never allocate components partially to production order. So what does this mean? This does mean these first 4 items, those were items, or those are items that I have on stock. I initially, when I did the EMAT calculation, I allocated them to this production order. We could allocate them, and then the allocation failed for this part. So we don't have this part currently on stock, and we don't have a purchase order for this system, and we don't have a production order for this part. So this allocation failed, and hence we removed this. So with the allocation types, you also get information like which material is missing. And here is the thing with the VAPS. The VAPS calculates the earliest material availability date based on documents. So you need to have a purchase order in the system. We currently do not look at lead time. So if I go to that item very quickly, if I view that item, I don't have it on stock. I don't have it on purchase order. They're not transferred. There's just no demand, no supply source. I just have this demand, and I have a lead time of 6 weeks. I need to purchase it, but the VAPS currently to calculate the EMAT, it needs a document. It doesn't look at the lead time, so the allocation failed here. So what I can do now, actually, I can add this to the schedule. And so I can take into account what is the lead time, 6 weeks. So I can say, okay, I check with capacity, I apply the routing, and then it goes to the resources that I wanted it to go to. And then I can say, okay, I need to check with my vendor. And if, so I would now, I would put it to the schedule. I would check with the vendor if they could deliver it by the beginning of week 8, and if not, then I would move it to beginning of week 10, and then create. And I see, oh, this is late, so this is rubbish. So maybe we juggle around with it a little bit, so that we will not be late. Will not be late on this, so that I have a demand date for this that then triggers the purchase order. And I would check this, like I would put this as a planned production onto the system, talk to my purchasing guys, and then create the purchase order, make it firm planned once I had in this case, once I have the promised receipt date from my vendor. But I could schedule it like this, and then again I have taken into account capacity constraints, and I know I have a to-do here on the purchasing side of things, because I added a production order to the schedule without exactly knowing when it will be available. But in the minute I do it like this, and in the minute I publish the simulation, this now would drive demand on the planning worksheet and also create the purchase order. However, as I already said, when we looked at this, this can become tricky as the VAPS requires a document for the EMAT calculation. It does not yet just consider the lead time. So we are currently specifying an enhancement of the EMAT functionality that we will work on, I would say, in the second quarter or the third quarter of the year, so that we then also take into account the lead time. So if we have a lead time on an item that where the replenishment system is purchased, that we then also get like a calculated EMAT. So not an EMAT based on real document, but an EMAT also based on taking into account lead times, so that as the production scheduler, we get an indication as to when this item will most likely be available, so that we get this indication like earlier, because right now we need to do it a little bit implicitly still. So this then brings me to the fifth and last scenario, where I again have a material constraint and a capacity constraint, and for that I have item 28. And here I'm also changing the process, because now I'm changing the process to no longer create the production order, add it to the schedule, and derive the finish date from there, but say, okay, I want to utilize a function that actually takes lead times into account, which the VAPS does not do yet. And this function is the capable to promise function. However, as I said initially, this capable to promise function requires that you set up, let's say, Business Central correctly, because the capable to promise function, and as I said, I ran a whole webinar on this in May last year. Recommend that you watch it, and then if you have questions, let's set up a demo or a meeting and discuss. But the capable to promise function looks at as to when items that you flag as critical, as to when they will be available based on their lead time. So the capable to promise function does not need the document that the EMAT calculation needs. And the capable to promise function also looks as to when will be ready based on the routing. And here is the trick thing. This part, looking at the material availability for those items that are flagged as critical based on their lead time, this really works well. But looking at as to when the production order will be finished based on the routing doesn't work well, because by default, Business Central works with the assumption of infinite capacity. However, Business Central also allows you to set up your work centers and machine centers with finite capacity. And this is what is called the capacity, so the capacity constrained resources. So if you set up your work centers and machine centers as capacity constrained resources, then, and if you flag critical items as critical, then the capable to promise function actually gives you good results as to when you will be able to deliver a certain item that a customer requests. However, the capacity constraint resources function in Business Central it has a lot of weaknesses. It had a lot of flaws. So what the capacity constraint resources function in Business Central does, it creates a schedule that is not actionable. It is completely unrealistic. Watch the webinar I made in May to see what this capacity constraint resources function actually does to your production orders. However, if you use the VAPS to build a manageable schedule, then this function can actually just be used as the backbone for the capable to promise function, and you can ignore it from the scheduling perspective. So let's look at this actually for as the final demo for the last couple of minutes for this webinar. So let's once go back to my demo. By the way, you have the capacity constrained resources, and here in my demo system I set them up. So I set my machine centers as capacity constrained resources, so that when Business Central runs this function, it takes them into account and then I use the VAPS to maintain the schedule. And now let's run the case that no longer the production guys are responsible for making the delivery time commitment, but the salespeople. So now I'm creating a sales order, right? So now I'm the sales guy and no longer the production guy. So now let's create a sales order. My beloved customer, Canon Group, they want something and they want this item. What was it? 28, I think it was. They want 50 units and they say when, and this is rubbish. 28. They want 50 units and they ask me, hey, when can you deliver? And what I do is I leave this quickly and we go very quickly into how did I set up this item, because this is actually interesting. So here's this item. This item has a BOM, and on that BOM are two more items. So there are just two items on that BOM. And those two items on the BOM, let me go there. This is one that I had. I added a lead time and I marked it as critical. And the other item that I need here for that case is the part 11, and same thing. It has a lead time. It has a shorter lead time. It only has like the one has 6 weeks of lead time. This has 3 weeks of lead time, but I also marked it as critical. So this is how this item is set up. And I will overrun this webinar a few minutes, but not much. So let's give me 3 more minutes to finish this. So now let's go back to the sales order. This is the sales order I started to create for this item 28 that we just looked at. And now the customer asked me as the sales guy, hey, when are you capable to deliver this? And what I can do is actually, I can run order promising. And the order promising function has, when am I capable to promise? And this function looks at as to when will I be finished this based on the routing. And now I set up the capacity constraint resources. So it's against finite capacity. And it looks also at all those items that I flagged as critical and looks at the lead times. And now it calculates. So it takes a while actually, and it tells me, okay, you can deliver this on the 23rd of March. Okay, so I now check with my customer, hey, what do you think about 23rd of March? The customer says fine, and then I accept this. And with the acceptance of this, we actually get automatically new lines to the planning worksheet. So if I look at the planning worksheet, I now get the suggestion, hey, you need to create a production order. I will get rid of this. You need to create a production order. It's 50 units for that item 28. This is due on the 21st because the date for the customer is the 22nd. And you need to create 2 purchase orders for those 2 items. And you see, if you look now at the purchase orders, the starting date and the ending date, you see there is one that has the 6 weeks time frame and the other has a 3 weeks time frame. So the date as to when the material is available at earliest, the 14th, when we can start the production order on the 15th. This date now was derived from the lead time of 6 weeks from this part, starting from today. And if I carry out the action messages, which I can do, I can carry out, I create the production order. I can also create, I copy them just, I make them, I'm just the production person. I copy them to the requisition. Yeah, you might. Anyway, if I would create the purchase orders, I won't do now, but I create a planned production order. Now I have the planned production order. I go to the VAPS, and actually I should create let me conclude this. Action messages. I just create the purchase orders. So I create the purchase order, make purchase orders. Sorry for that. I see there's a question. Let me finish this quickly. If I create the simulation, if I do the EMAT allocation, I got all the information that I have. Now I have the sales order, I have the production order, I have the purchase orders. So I will see that production order now. In my simulation, it's here. It is not red because I have the material available, and now it is scheduled backward from there. And now I can say apply the routing, and it takes into account as to when the material is there, it takes into account capacity, and I've scheduled it as we suggested it to our customer. And it also doesn't use the capacity here because we got the earliest material availability to the purchase order that I just created, and the purchase order was built based on the lead time we have here. And with this, I'm done with my demo part, and I see that this question. I just want to make this one slide. And this is the word of caution. I have this idea, and I had this idea of combining the capable to promise function, which I showed you quickly right now, the capacity constrained resources, and the VAPS. And the idea is a little bit strange. There are also some friends of mine who said, hey, Martin, this is actually provocative because we, as a consultant, we actually tell our customers never to use capacity constrained resources, and we tell them never to use capable to promise. But I think if you use capacity constrained resources function as a backbone for the capable to promise, and then use the VAPS to schedule the production orders and to manage the schedule, then this can work. This can work very well. However, you should be really, really familiar with the capable to promise function and its disadvantages, and the capacity constrained resources and its disadvantages. And then if you know both disadvantages, then you can decide, okay, for me, the advantages are higher, and I combine this with the VAPS, and then I'm fine. I see customer cases in which this works really, really well. But this must be a case-by-case discussion between you and your partner, or between you and your partner and us, or between you and us. Of course, we have some homework with the earliest material availability date function, although I think it is great because it fills a real big gap in Business Central. But later this year, we definitely should add the lead times there. On the other hand, if there are some partners, some manufacturing savvy partners on the call, I really would be pleased if some of you start playing around with capable to promise and capacity constrained resources and VAPS and give me feedback on this. And with this, I'm opening up for question, and I see there is already one. The question is, what is happening when the material is only partly available? We have some on hand now, but not enough. So when it is only partially available, there are two cases. So if you have some of them in stock and some of them will come via a purchase order later, then we will set the earliest material availability date to the latest date, so as to when the last purchase order will arrive based on the expected receipt date. If you have not yet a purchase order in the system, then you will recognize which material is missing and that you should create those purchase order in the system. We will never, with the VAPS, allocate material only partially to a production order. The other thing is, Business Central has routing links and routing link codes. And with the routing link codes, you can actually kind of control at which operation step certain material should be available. So this means if you need all material with the exception of one for the first routing step, and this last material would be something that you only need at the fourth operation step, then if you have all material available with the exception of the one, then you can start whatever the first two operating steps and then do the last one when the final material is available. So, but if you have more questions on this, we definitely should do a separate session on this, and or I highly recommend that you also watch the webinar that I did in November, where I really talked a lot about exactly this topic, the earliest material availability date. If you have more questions, ask them now, or as I indicated earlier, send them to me via email. I'm really happy to hear from you. I'm happy to get some feedback on this webinar. I'm also happy to hear some suggestion what you want me to do as the next webinar or the next webinar. So shoot me an email or connect with me on LinkedIn, and send me your ideas, your thoughts, your questions. But also, if you think we can do better in some areas, send me everything that you want to share with me. You definitively get a timely answer, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and discussing with you further production scheduling scenarios. With this, thank you very much for today, and see you soon in one of our next webinars or in one of the upcoming events. Thanks. Bye-bye.